crowd for brown bag history was 6. So for 18 to be a small crowd was actually pretty good. Some of you were here last night. We had a Chilean ski history evening. We had 40 people out for that. It was a really great event. So if you were here last night, you are going to hear some repeats. There's some new information too, but bear with me for the bit of repetition. So we'll start by acknowledging the land, traditions, and culture of the 4 nations, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, the Sinaiaks, and the Silks. We acknowledge our use and habitation of this land sacred to these 4 nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So just to recap, the skiing really started in Revelstoke in the early 1890s. The first mention of skiing in Revelstoke was when a fellow named Ole Sandberg skied into town from his mining claims at Albert Canyon. And the locals were kind of amazed by that, and they were referring to his skis as Norwegian snowshoes, and described them as being these long slats, thin slats of wood, up to 10 feet long. We've got a pair downstairs that's 8.5 feet long, and described them using 1 pole. So people started picking up the sport. This fellow on the end was F.B. Wells. He had a men's clothing store, and he started bringing in skis from Minnesota, which of course was a hotbed of Scandinavian immigration. So there was a lot of the Swedes and Norwegians who'd come to Minnesota, so it was a good place to get a hold of skis. This was sort of an informal club, but as I say, they're formal enough to have matching coats and hats. So they took it a little bit seriously. They were mostly doing a lot of distance skiing there. They would ski down to Arrowhead and even go across by boat and ski into the Lardo area. So they were doing quite long distances on their skis, and some slope skiing as well. But it wasn't until 1914 that there was a big wave of immigration from Norway and Sweden. A lot of the families were living in the Big Eddy at the time, and they decided that they wanted to form a competitive ski club, and they wanted to have winter carnivals, ski carnivals, and competitions here. So they formed in the fall of 1914. By the February of 1915, they held their first winter carnival, and it was held just on the jumping events were held on the lower slopes of Mount Revelstoke, not right in the park. They made a big deal about it. They had this fellow build this giant 40-foot tall snowman near the station, and they actually had it wired so that that torch lit up. They had a big ceremony and speeches by the mayor and other officials, and a snowball fight for the boys, and handing out peanuts to all the kids. 2 things that wouldn't happen now, sanctioned by the schools anymore. So they went ahead and they had their first winter event. One of the people that was really involved in right from the very beginning and really became Revelstoke's ski hero was Nils Nelson. And this was him when they were still living in Norway with his father, Eliseus Nelson. And they were living in Tromsø, Norway. Nils was born there on June 3rd, 1894, to Eliseus and his wife Ida Nelson. Ida was actually from Sweden, so Nils is Norwegian and Swedish ancestry. They came to Revelstoke in 1913. Mr. Nelson was working as a carpenter, and he was also involved in mining and farming. They had a farm in Big Eddy. They had 1 other son, Ivan, and 4 daughters, and all of them were involved in skiing. When Eliseus Nelson died in 1937, his obituary said, It was largely through the efforts of the Nelson family that skiing as a sport was made popular in BC, later spreading throughout the continent. So Nils Nelson competed in Rossland in 1915. He came second to champion Ingwald Ingen from Phoenix, BC, which is near Grand Forks. So when they had their first competition in 1915, there were 1,000 spectators there, and Nils Nelson came in first in the jumping events in 1915, and so in 1916 they built the jump within Mount Revelstoke, and that was the jump area that's still it's not obviously not an active jump area now, but the jump is still there. The judges tower there. There's a really great interpretive exhibit called Nels Knickers that sort of really celebrates that ski history. And so the first competition was held there in 1916. And this is showing the jumping in 1916. And at that time, Nels took the Canadian Ski Jumping Championship. And he won what was called the Nabob Cup. And we actually have that trophy in one of the cases at the top of the stairs out there. He jumped 183 feet, but which was higher than the world record at that time, but it was considered an unofficial jump. But he did become the Canadian ski champion. Just wanted to point out something here. You can see the crowds there, but if you look at that line there, that's horses and carriages that were bringing people up to the hill.
They had to walk.
So also in 1916, they had a 7-mile men's race, and this is Nels Nelson's 1A. He came second in the race to this fellow who was a champion ski racer from Alberta that had come to compete. This is Nels and one of his sisters, Elise Nelson, on their farm in the Big Eddy. Elise Nelson is the mother of Lola Gallicano and Olive Lazzarato. And this was when Ivan married Emma Picard, and they went on to have 10 children. And the youngest daughter is still alive down at the coast. And Emma Picard was, her grandfather was the senior Sam Needham. There were 3 Sam Needhams, and the very eldest was the father of Emma's mother. And Emma's mother married a Picard, so she's related to the Needham family that are still in town. So this is when he did the world record in 1925 with a jump of 240 feet. He took in 1919 he jumped 170 feet in competition. That was setting a new Canadian record. He retained his Canadian championship. So on February 12, 1920, he won the Canadian Ski Jumping Championship for the 4th consecutive time, jumping 185 feet. There were over 2,000 people at that event. The runner-up was S. Steinwell of Chicago, and his sister Nan Nelson won the Silver Cup in the ladies' special for the best form jump. So they had some of the women jumping off the boys' jump as well that year. His brother Ivan, that we'll see in a few minutes, set the record for boys under 15 with a leap of 112 feet. So Nels held the Canadian record from 1916 to 1932. breaking his own record 5 times in 10 years. In 1925, he set the world amateur record with a jump of 240 feet, which remained unbroken for 5 years. And he held the hill record between 1916 and 1932. So this is him doing the 240 feet jump in 1925. This was 1923, doing a 202 foot jump. In 1926, the Spalding Champions trading card series was produced, and Nels Nelson had a card in that series. The card itself is only about this big. It's quite tiny. I think they were in like cigarette packages at the time. And the Spalding trading card series had about 210 athletes represented in the series, and that included like Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb, baseball champions, and Jack Dempsey, who was a boxing champion. So it was, you know, a big deal at the time. He was definitely considered a world-class athlete. In 1930, he attended the second annual Leavenworth tournament and came first in his class and won this beautiful coffee set and the silver tray that it's sitting on. That's the engraving on the tray. I just got these photographs 2 days ago from Nell's granddaughter, and she's the daughter of Vivian, the youngest daughter that's still alive. And Vivian has moved into a care home, and there's tons of Nelson relatives. So they've decided that rather than trying to figure out who in the family would get this, they would like to donate it to the museum. So they're going to bring this to the museum this year. So we're quite excited about getting that. So that was what he won at Leavenworth. Really beautiful set. The Revelstoke Ski Club in the 1920s. There was Nels there, and his brother Ivan, right there, his younger brother. Ivan was about 9 years younger than Nels. In January of 1921, Nels and Ivan joined the best jumpers in the world for an event at the Calgary Winter Carnival. They had a jump erected on top of the grandstand, and Ivan and Nels both jumped on there. There's a note in 1923 saying Nels beat his own record. The one and only Nels Nelson demonstrated, in the words of one of the Eastern jumpers, that he is in a class by himself in the ski sport by going to the extreme top of the trestle on the world's biggest hill, and in the face of a heavy snowfall, which practically blinded all jumpers, made a beautiful jump of 202 feet. I think, go back here, there, when he did the 1925 jump, there was a description of that in a newspaper. It said, the hope of every ski fan in Revelstoke, as well as that of those who may not be enthusiasts in this particular winter sport, was realized last Wednesday when all records on skis were broken and the marvelous one of Nels Nelson, who jumped 240 feet, was hung up. This remarkable record was made by Nelson under the handicap of being far from in the best of shape for such a venture, as he was under medical attention for a slight attack of the flu. This, however, did not deter him from defending his laurels gained in the past. Ideal weather prevailed for the big events in ski sport, the hill also being in better condition than for years past. There seemed to be a feeling in the air that previous records would be shattered and new ones established. Nels Nelson was determined to beat the record of 210 feet made by Hans Hansen last year in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Nelson fell in his first trial jump, but in the competition he made 2 new records, first beating Hansen to jump by 2 feet, and in the next attempt making the astounding jump of 240 feet, gliding away to a graceful finish. This record, besides retrieving for him the amateur world's record, also exceeds the professional record of 229 feet, made here in 1921 by Henry Hall of Detroit. That record stood until 1931, when it was broken by the American jumper Alf Engen. Nels was qualified to compete in the 1928 Olympics in Switzerland, and he couldn't afford to go there on his own, so he'd made arrangements to work his way across on a freighter to get there. But the Olympic Committee said that that wasn't a dignified way for an Olympic athlete to travel, and they said that he couldn't travel, work across by freighter. He couldn't afford to go otherwise, and they never provided any funding for him to go, so he didn't go to the Olympics. For a couple of winters, he worked as a ski instructor at Lucerne, Quebec, and his brother also, Ivan, also worked at the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec for several seasons. It's doing a twin jump with his brother Ivan in, this would be about 1920. Nels was really revered by the local boys. Carl Gunnarsson, in a later interview, said, in those days we had little tips on the front of our skis, and Nels' skis were starting to chip a little bit in the front. So he put some electrician's tape on his points. So we all did the same thing. We figured that would make us jump better. He'd get pieces of lead and put them either on the front or the back of his skis to get him in the right balance. So we all had lead on our skis. Of course, we could never compete against or get as good as Nels. He was absolutely our idol and a good sport. So, Nels actually lost a hand in a hunting accident in 1933. And after that, he didn't jump any longer, but became quite active in the administrative end of the sport. In 1934, he was the sports director at Grouse Mountain Chalet, and he actually designed a special ski boot. It was being manufactured by the Lucky Company in Vancouver. The boots were built to Nelson's specifications, built on a time-tested Scandinavian model. The features of the boot were a wire strap for extra support at the ankle and instep, leather-lined and thoroughly watertight. They were 7 inches high with felt binding at the top for a snugger fit and to keep out the snow. That the company was busy turning out the boots, which were expected to be in retail stores by the end of January of that year. One thing I mentioned last night as well is that Nels Nelson was responsible for how people jumped. When they started the hill here, the tradition was to sort of be standing up straight when you were jumping. But he said that on this hill, because of how steep it was, if you tried to do that, you'd just fall like that. You just sort of hit the wind and go straight down. So they developed the forward lean, and they actually refer to that as vorlage. So that was a technique that Nels and the other jumpers developed on this hill. And if you do go up to the jumping area there, and they have the Nels Neckers bronze cast of a jumper, if you go into that, you'll do the forward lean too. The good thing is that you're not going to go any farther. It's a little scary when you lean in, but once you're there, you know you're solid.
Didn't Ivan have a totally different style too?
Yeah. So this is Ivan, the younger brother. He was born. Sorry. My apologies for being a bit scattered today. Might have been a bit ambitious of me to schedule 2 major talks in the same week. So I didn't get around to doing this one until this morning. Just wanted to say that Nels Nelson died quite young. He was just 49 years old. He was working as CPR baggageman on the Revelstoke division of the CPR, running between Kamloops and Field. And he died on his trip at Field on June 7th, 1943, at the age of 49 of a heart attack. So quite young, and left his wife and the 10 children. Some of them were older by then, but they were married in 1919, so some of the children were probably still at home at that time. So Ivan Nelson was born in Norway in 1904 and came out when the family did. He was known for his form. Nels was known for the distance, but Ivan was said to have perfect form, and people would say he was like a bird in flight when he jumped. There's a story, interview with Isabel Corsier, who said that if she was at the Mountain View School, which is now the distillery and old school eatery, and said if she looked out the window or looked up from the schoolyard, she could always tell if it was Ivan who was jumping because of his form. So he just had a really beautiful form. He started winning boys competitions in the early 1920s. And in 1922, he was the world's boy champion. This was him jumping in Banff around 1922. Right after that, he got a job working at the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec. In 1923, he came back to Revelstoke for the jumping tournament, and his first jump resulted in a bad spill. He injured his head and shoulder, but he refused medical treatment until after watching his brother Nels jump. And he also died quite young. He died in 1953 at the age of 48, also of a heart attack. He was married to Thelma Nelson, Thelma Harwood, and Thelma lived to be, I think, 106. And the interesting thing is that Thelma had come here with her family, and Nels was from here, but they actually met in Quebec at where he was working, and they met at a dance. That's skating in front of the Chateau Frontenac around 1928. Yeah. Is that a lovely picture? Yeah. So all of the sisters, there was Elise, Rebecca, Nan, and another one whose name I can't remember right at the moment, but all of them were involved in skiing as well. They usually took part in the ski racing, but they had some pretty stiff competition here with Anna Gunnarsson. And the Gunnarssons were a family that also came from Norway at the same time as the Nelson family. They also settled in the Big Eddy area. And the Nelsons, there was a lot of other families as well who were involved in the ski being developed here as a sport. But the Gunnarssons and the Nelsons were, kind of really sort of revered as two of the families that really promoted the sport here and got it going. The Gunnarssons had 4 sons, 3 of them born in Norway, and the youngest one born here. And Anna Gunnarsson was a really well-known ski racer. There's another picture showing Henrietta, that's the other daughter. So Henrietta, Nana, and Elise, and the other daughter was Rebecca, who was in the previous photograph, and Anna Gunnarsson, about 1921. And the one daughter, Rebecca, who's shown here, she married a man named Johnson, and one of their sons was Art Johnson, who was also a really well-known jumper and really involved in the ski club in the 40s and 50s. So Anna Gunnarsson was a really well-known ski racer. She competed in Banff, Calgary, and various places in BC from 1915 until into the 1930s. Was still racing at the age of 48. At one point, she started behind the 17-year-old boys and still crossed the finish line first. She often gave other women racers a head start of about 100 yards and still won most of those races. She died in August 1956 at the age of 73. Her husband, Jorgen, we don't have any pictures of him, but he was also involved in skiing and was known as the local ski maker. He had we have a pair of his skis that he made with his mark on them. A lot of the local skiers were buying his locally made skis.
Look at her cute bloomers.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty amazing woman. This picture was taken by Emma Roberts. We have a lot of Emma Roberts photos in our collection. I think I just have a couple of pictures out of order here. Excuse me, I'm just going to jump ahead. Sorry about that. These are also the Gunnarsons. This is Hans Gunnarsson. And he was one of the sons of Jorgen and Anna, and he was really making a name for himself as well. He was expected to be the next Nels Nelson, but and during he enlisted during the Second World War, and he was an instructor training soldiers in the use of skis. He had exceptional ability and had near perfect form. His favorite event was jumping, but he also won in cross-country, slalom, downhill, and combined. Unfortunately, he enlisted as a gunner with the Canadian Army and was killed in action in the Netherlands in November of 1944. They opened a second jump in 1939 on the far side of the eastern end of the hill, and it was later renamed the Hans Gunnarsson jump. And there's Gunnar and Hans in the 1930s. At the age of 7, he had a jump of 72 feet.
Oh.
Starting out. So we'll jump back to So Isabel Corsier was born in Revelstoke in 1906. Her family had come here in the 1880s. Her father, Henry Noble Corsier, had a general store on Front Street, and they had a large home at the south end of Front Street where the big apartment building is there now. And she said she was sort of brought up on skis. Her first pair of skis were made by local fellow Bob Blackmore, who was a river boatman on the Columbia, and said that she just started skiing, naturally as a young girl. She competed in ski events in the 1920s, including ski joring, which is riding behind a horse. She was probably the only woman who was participating in ski joring. And in 1922, she competed with the boys on the boys' jump and made 84 feet, which was the women's world record. There weren't a lot of women jumping then, so but she made the record jump. In July 4th, 1923, she was in a ski tournament at Paradise Valley Rainier National Park in Washington. Said she gave a sensational exhibition of ski jumping on the icy slopes. President Harding was among the distinguished members of the audience on this occasion. So Ms. Corsier received a great ovation and a special trophy. In 1925, she went to McGill to study physical education. She excelled in track and field, tennis, ice hockey, and basketball. She did exhibition jumps in Montreal and was the first woman to go over the Côte des Neiges jump in Montreal. A writer in the Calgary Herald of 1927 talked about her technique and said, "She was fearless and graceful like some well-poised bird. Meeting and talking to her, I found her youth, fresh beauty, modesty, and seriousness very attractive." And these are some photographs that actually came from Ken's aunt Marge. This is Marge here. And the Englishes were friends with the Corsier family. And this is Isabel. They went on a little trip to the top of Mount Revelstoke. And you can see she's dressed in quite a masculine fashion and has quite short hair. You can see it in that photograph. So she was a unique person, and as I say, very athletic, and was spent most all of her career as a high school gym teacher. And that's again jumping in Quebec. So Bob Lindburn, now there's a little bit of confusion over his name. He was always known locally as Bob Lindborn with an M, but in the records from the family, his birth certificate and enlistment papers and marriage certificates all have the name spelled with an N. So we couldn't use both spellings, but as I say, locally he was always known as Bob Lindborn, and the family was known as Lindborn as well. He was born in Ontario in 1912 and came to Revelstoke with his family as a child. They lived at the base of Mount McPherson, and he didn't try on skis until he was 13 years old. He built a jump on his family farm, and he entered his first competition in 1926 at the age of 14, and in his own words was an absolute flop. But he said he practiced every chance he got, and within a year he was winning in his class and getting close to records. And this is him about in 1932 when he did make the world record. But a year before that, in 1931, there was an event held in Revelstoke that came to be known as the Great Fiasco. It was the first time that the Dominion Championships were being held in Revelstoke. So the Eastern jumpers were coming here. And the Dominion Championships were advertised far and wide, and this was the first time they were being held in the West. So the local jumpers were really excited to be able to showcase their hill to the Eastern jumpers. The problem was that all the judges and the jumpers from the East took one look at this hill and said there's no way they were going over the A jump. So the judges made the decision to hold the A events on the B hill. The locals were absolutely outraged, and they refused to award any of the prizes because they said they didn't jump off the A jump. They don't deserve the A jump prizes. So they just the newspaper said that they figured that the competitors from the East had talked to all the judges and said that they weren't going to go off the hill. So the judges made the decision that they would move the events to the B hill. So that after all the competitors went off the B jump, Bob Lindburn walked to the Class A jump and effortlessly and beautifully jumped 196 feet. He jumped twice in defiance of the judges. Judge H.K. Grimsgard reported to the Revelstoke Review that the judges deemed the hill unsafe and that Lindburn was able to pull off the jumps because he had the confidence of training on the big hill. The judges disallowed Lindburn's jumps, stating they were exhibition jumps only. The crowd was irate and stayed that way for a while. So this fiasco caused a huge division between East and West. A few days later, on February 8, 1931, a special tournament was held by the locals to protest that the big hill was not unsafe. Bob Lindburn made 6 jumps, averaging 226 feet, a feat that was never equaled in the Dominion. And of course, when he's making those 6 jumps, he's having to walk up the hill between each jump as well. They called that the Day of Vindication. And it said it brought out all the local jumpers, as well as Bob, and then Hans Gunnarsson and Ted Morgan for the Class A jump. He said the Class B jumpers performed better than the Eastern Dominion competitors of the previous week. And even the boys on the C and D jumps jumped off the B hill. They were just trying to prove that this hill was safe and that those guys were just chicken. The locals were raring to go after being shut down by Eastern judges, And that's the name that the hill started being known as Suicide Hill. It's kind of an ironic name, you know, that there was nothing that was perfectly safe, according to them. And it's true, I'm not aware of any deaths on the hill. I know there were fractures and injuries, but no deaths. So Bob Lindbergh took the world record of 269 feet in 1932. And in 1933 did a jump of 287 feet. He represented Canada in the 1932 Olympics in Lake Placid and came in 18th. And there's some jumping in 1933. He did a ski ascent of Mount Begbie in 1932. He left town at 4 a.m. on May 15th, 1932. Took him by car 7 miles towards the base of the peak. He said that he was not too far up the mountain before he put on his skis. He set a fast pace, not knowing how long it would take him. And in his own words, this was in the Canadian Alpine Journal of 1932, he said, "On reaching the foot of the glacier, I was surprised to find that it was just 8 a.m. I enjoyed the wonderful skiing that is to be had on the long, smooth slopes of the glacier. After 2 hours of skiing on the glacier, I halted and enjoyed my lunch. This consisted of raw eggs, oranges, and raisins, which in my opinion forms the most satisfactory lunch for strenuous exercise." He continued upward to the highest peak. He said, "In places there were crevasses 4 feet in width, thousands of feet in length, and so deep that I could not see the bottom. The safe passage of these was much facilitated by the fact that I was wearing skis. That climbing to the last pinnacle, I was forced to remove my skis, as it was necessary to hack out holes in the ice with my ski poles in order to get a foothold. The ice walls were exceedingly steep, and I had to go very carefully, as a misstep would have led to a 2,000-foot fall. Before attempting the last bit, I sized up the situation very carefully, and convincing myself that I could complete the climb, reached the summit at 1 p.m. An hour later, he started to descend. He said, "After many wild, swift rides down the mountainside, the valley was reached, and I arrived at Revelstoke the same evening at 6 p.m. So that's the first known ski ascent of Mount Begbie.
Kathy, he was 20 at the time? He was born in 1912?
1912, yeah. So, yeah. This is actually a copy of his article of the ski ascent from the Canadian Alpine Journal. He had suffered a concussion in jump in 1935, which ended his jumping career. He was had been a friend of a man named Buck Crump, who was from Revelstoke and ended up as the head of CPR in Canada. And Buck Crump made sure that he always had a job. But one day in 1970, he went out for his usual walk. He'd walk several miles out of town and then come back. And one day he never returned from his walk, and his body was never recovered. So nobody's sure exactly what happened to him. I have to speed up a little bit here. It's been taking a little bit too long. But this is just going to throw in this picture of Arnfinn Bergman. Arnfinn wasn't a local jumper. He was part of the Norwegian ski team that came here in 1950. And it was really that event that started the Tournament of Champions. And he did return to Norway, but he did live in Revelstoke for a couple of seasons. He married a local woman, and he did stay here and was helping to train some of the younger jumpers for a while. But he was a really well-known athlete in Norway. This is actually a signed photograph that he gave to Alan McGuinness, who was a friend of his. The McRae family was really involved in skiing. This is actually the senior McRae, Alex Sr., and they had several children, all of whom were involved in skiing. This is Mary Burridge McRae. She married Alex Jr., known as Shorty. And this is Barb Bigu now. And can't remember which is the older, which is the, which of her brothers is in, that'd be Dawn, yeah. But there was an article in one of the, in a magazine from 1927 saying that Revelstoke children went from the cradle to their skis. And, you know, that was pretty much the case, definitely in the McCrae family. They were all out very young skiing. Don McCrae, who is brother of Shorty, was a really well-known local skier. He was quite a good skier, both in, especially in downhill and slalom. This is the finish of the slalom run in 1939. This is Alex McCrae near Heather Lodge, the top of Mount Revelstoke. The McCraes were really involved in the construction and operation of Heather Lodge. Craig Rutherford was also very involved in that. Craig was the one that made an arrangement with Parks to have the lodge built at the summit of Mount Revelstoke. And Don was involved with the construction as well, and Don was the first manager and cook at Heather Lodge. Really phenomenal story. In 1939, Alex and Bill McCrae and their cousin Jim McDonald and Don McCrae decided to do a 193-mile ski trip around the Big Bend. And the road was just about complete then, but the road wasn't open in the winter. So there was, it wasn't like a road there, but they decided to do this ski trip. Alex became ill during the trip and had to return after mile 73. He actually was staying at Andy Kitson's cabin for a while, but the other three made it all around to Golden and were really feted as champions for such an arduous undertaking. And then the following January, the three of them, Bill and Jim and Don, decided to go even farther. And they did a skiing marathon of 500 miles from Revelstoke north to Jasper via the Big Bend and Tetjean Cache, and then south to Banff, arriving in time for the Banff Winter Carnival. That trip was broadcast all over Canada, and the boys had quite a lot of good tales to tell of their adventure. And Alex McCrae and Mary Burridge actually had their honeymoon at Heather Lodge in 1941. Mary was writing the ski column in the local paper for quite a few years. This is Craig Rutherford. He was very involved in skiing in Revelstoke, really involved with the ski club for many years. And there was, I mean, there's a lot that I'm not including in here that really had a lot to do with developing the Tournament of Champions and developing Revelstoke as a ski destination. This is skiing on Mount Revelstoke in the 1940s. These are Dickie photographs. Just mentioned the Benisons briefly. Edith and Lloyd Benison were also very involved in promoting the Tournament of Champions and promoting skiing. And Lloyd was a jumper himself as well. But this picture is taken around 1955 of John McGinnis, Grant Gunnarsson, Larry Nellis, and Nolan Stringer. John McGinnis started skiing at age 7. The family had come here from the coast. And by age 9, he was jumping on the B Hill. He and his brother Alan started out on the Hans Gunnarsson jump, which is the one a little bit east. And John went on to be a member of the Canadian ski jumping team for 12 years, competing in Europe and North America. And there's him in when he was on the Canadian ski jumping team. Really beautiful form. In 1961, John McGinnis and Carrie Lean were named to the Canadian national jumping team and were chosen to go to the World Championships in Poland. There's John and Carrie Lean, and this guy named Howard McDonald and Lloyd Bennison. There's John jumping. John also competed in the 1964 Olympics and 1962 World Championship in Innsbruck, and was on the Canadian team for several years. He said we'd go to Europe in November sometimes, and sometimes we wouldn't get back here until probably the end of March. I was on the team for about 12 years actually, but I think we went to Europe 7 times. But he said we'd go on a competition to Europe, and it would be the first time we'd put on our skis for the season. And for the Europeans, it might be their thousands, I can't say that, they had jumped 1,000 times for the season. So he said there was just no comparison. But said despite the lack of coaching and time training on the hill, John's prowess on jumping put Revelstoke back on the map in terms of ski jumping. In 1969, he won the North American Championship in Quebec. This is when he participated in the that's the Innsbruck? Or is that, yeah. And, yeah, this was in 1964. And there's Nazi Green. And we have John's coat in the exhibit at the top of the stairs, coat and hat. This is from newspaper 1969. It says ski jump champs. Prime Minister Trudeau poses with winner John McGuinness and runners-up following the North American Ski Championships held at Camp Fortune, Quebec. McGuinness, 29, of Revelstoke, BC, is a member of the Canadian National Ski Team. Just through this picture, and a couple of younger skiers, there's Claudette Bennison and Greg Humphreys, who also had good ski careers for a while as youngsters. Let's talk about Larry Nellis a bit. Larry, this is an article from the 1968 Revelstoke Review. It was an article reprinted from the Montreal Star. It says, if all the coaches knew the best way to teach, then the best racers will win most of the time. That is the theory that pushes Larry Nellis relentlessly on in his position as Director of Alpine Racing Coaches for the Canadian Amateur Ski Association. And he was conducting clinics for coaches throughout Canada, teaching about 275 coaches across the country. Nellis was born in Revelstoke, and he coached the Canadian National B team in 1964, and was also a noted skier, downhill skier himself. Kendra Kabelka, the young girl, was born in born in Manitoba and came here at the age of 10 with her family in 1977. She didn't start skiing until she was age 11, which was considered a late starter for a ski racer. She started in the Nazi Green Ski Club here, and quickly the BC ski team came to Revelstoke looking for young racers that they could include in their BC team. They didn't have a lot of girls on their team, so they were looking for girls with potential. And Kendra was taken in under that training program. She was coached by Glenn Wortle, who went on to coach the national team, men's team. She was on the BC ski team for 4 years, and then by age 18 she was on the Canadian national ski team. She did the World Cup circuit in Europe and North America, doing about a dozen races a year. She was in the top 10 in the world in 4 races. She was the 16th in the World Championships, and won the Canadian races a couple of times, and took gold and silver medals in Pan American Games. She said, I was a kid learning to ski, so it was just a big fun mountain on Mount Mackenzie. That for my age, it was perfect. The great place to learn. The access to it was the key rather than the size of the hill. And just before we close, I wanted to mention Paul Mayer, who was the developer of the Mount Mackenzie ski hill. He came here in the early 1960s, and they opened Mount Mackenzie ski hill on Boxing Day of 1963. Mayer was born in northern Italy, but just on the border with Austria, and grew up in Austria, and later came to Canada. He worked at Grouse Mountain as a ski instructor before coming to Revelstoke in 1961. And when the first hill opened, there was just an 800-foot rope tow, and of course they really developed it over the years. They built an A-frame cabin at the base of the hill as a coffee shop. That's Paul Mayer facing the camera in 1973. Paul Mayer, he just died last year, just quite fairly recently. This is, he was running a ski school there. This is kind of from an ad from 1966 where they're doing night skiing, but the really funny part about this is that's supposed to say Modern Austrian Ski School, but there's a typo, it says Modern Australian Ski School, so a little bit of foreshadowing there. So that's it for today. Next Brown Bag History on February 19th is on Heritage Neighborhoods, and then we'll have a Heritage Day here on Saturday, February 22nd. I'll start with a walking tour at 10 o'clock if it's not too icy outside. And then we'll have it set up here. I've got myself and a couple of volunteers will be helping people find the history of their heritage homes. And then at 3 o'clock we'll do a heritage slideshow as well. Any comments or questions?
I was thinking, they're all junk